As we begin this video, please make sure to copy these lines of CSS from my repository and copy them into your index.css so that whatever we're going to be building in this video is going to behave as you would expect it to behave. The repository is linked in the description and it is called HTML CSS YT. So in this video, we're going to be building a sign-up form, and I've designed it in this way so that we can use CSS grid for this layout. And then I'm also going to show you how we can use CSS flexbox to achieve the same. So let's get started. So what I'm going to do is inside Visual Studio Code, I'm going to create a new folder and I'm going to call this project 2. And this is going to be called sign up form. And inside here, I want to import my design image. So let me get it. Okay, so now when you go ahead and close the repository, you're going to have this design image for your reference. So the first thing that I'm going to do is inside this folder, I'm going to create a new file and I'm going to call this index.html. And then inside here, I just want to say exclamation and enter using emmet to generate a boilerplate for me. And then I'm going to change this title to say sign up form. Maybe say project 2. And then inside the body, I'm going to have a div with a class of container. And if you still don't understand how this happens, it's because I'm using an extension called emmet. So if I want to create a div with a class of container, I can say create a div dot container, which is going to create a div with a class of container. And by default, if you don't specify the element that you want and just say dot container, then emmet is going to create a div for you. So this div with a class of container is the one that is going to act as a wrapper for our sign up form right here. So inside here is where we're going to have our form, and we can create a form using the form element like so. And then this form, the way the layout works is that I have a title on top first of all, right? And then I have a label and then I have an input. And notice that the label and the input are acting like one component, and then this other label and this input is acting like another component. So if I want to use CSS flexbox and grid, then I'm going to have to place these two inside one element and then these two inside another element, so that when I say display grid, then they're going to display side by side. So I'm going to create an H1 that says create an account. Remember the rule, you can only have one H1 per page and you must have an H1 for every page. Okay, and then inside here now I'm going to create another div with a class of form-inner, because inside this div with a class of form-inner is where I want to use CSS grid for all of this. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to create a label, and this label is going to be for the first name, and then this is going to say first name, and then below this label I'm going to have an input. And you create an input by just having the input tag, which is a self-closing tag once again. And then the type for this, it takes in an attribute of type, and I'm going to have this as text because the name of a person is usually text. The date of birth is going to have an input of type date, and then the password is going to have an input of type password, and then the email address is going to have an input with the type of email. Okay, so it's very specific to each one of these. So input of type text, the name is going to be first name. And the reason why I have the name here is because this label is going to be linking to the name of the input, so that when you click on the label, then it's going to place focus on the corresponding input. Okay, and then this is also going to have an ID of first name. And then I'm going to have set this to required so that you can't submit the form unless you fill in this input, which is just some HTML validation. Okay, and then once I have this, then I'm going to save this. Okay, and I'm saving it for a reason, so that I can open up my server, my local server using live server. So I'm going to right click inside here and I'm going to say open with live server. And then I'm also going to add our CSS file so that we can style this out to be better looking. Okay, so once our server opens up, you can see that we have our title that says create an account, and then we have our input of first name right inside here. And the interesting thing about HTML5 is that if you have ever filled up a similar input, if the form doesn't have an attribute of autocomplete off, then when you click on this input, then it's going to show you a drop down of all the data that you have filled in before. And if you want to disable this, then you can go into the form right here and can specify an auto complete and set this to off. So when I save this, if I try to fill in now, you can see I don't have any suggestions. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to create my index.css file for this so that I can reference it inside here, and then we can style it out because there's something that I want to show you. And you know what, just so that we don't confuse the names with this, inside here I'm going to call this style.css or styles.css. Okay, and then I'm going to go into my index.html and I want to link my style.css. So link href styles.css, and then I'm going to save this, and nothing is going to change on the screen because our style sheet doesn't have any data. Now I do want to mention that in the last project I mentioned that this is going to be our global CSS file, and the reason for that is because I have the font that I'm going to be using throughout all the projects, and then I'm resetting the padding, the margin, and setting the box sizing to border box, and then I'm just adding some bit of global styles here. So I'm saying that for all the unordered list, I want the list title tab to be none, so that it's not going to have any bullets or it's not going to have any numbers. And then I'm setting the image to have a max width of 100% so that they don't overflow outside of their container or outside of the device width, causing a horizontal scroll bar. And then I'm setting the width to 100%, which means that the images are always going to take up 100% of the screen or 100% of the container in which they are placed. And then here I'm setting the font family of the body to Inter, which is the font that we imported from fonts.google.com. And then in case this fails to load, then I have a fallback font of sans serif. And then I'm setting the font size of the body to 16 pixels, which is going to be our root EM value. And if you don't understand the root EM value, you can go back and check the video where I was explaining CSS units. So now what I want to do is I also want to link this index.css file inside my project to sign up form. So what I'm going to do is, because I want the index.css file to load in fast, then I want to place it on top of our style.css. So I'm going to link this into /index.css, and it's // because I need to go outside of this folder and then into here, because if I just say /index.css, then this file is not being referenced anywhere in our project. So I have to say // so that I can go outside of our actual folder, which is the sign up form. And once again, the reason why I've placed it on top is because I want this file to load in first and then this file to load in second. So I'm going to save this, and you'll notice that the styles are going to be reset and the font has changed as well. So I'm going to place this to the left, or to the right, sorry, and then I'm going to place this to the left so that we can begin styling it out. So inside my styles.css, what I want to do is I want to access the class of container, and I want to give it a background color of hashtag F1 F1 F1, which is a very slight gray. And then inside here I want to add a padding of 1.25 rem to push the content inwards, and then I want to add a margin of 1.25 rem so that the container is going to push inwards by 1.25 rem outside of the body so that it doesn't go all the way to the edges. So I'm going to save this, and you can say this is what happens. Remember that the reason why this works is because of our box sizing, and the box sizing we have set it to border box here, which means that it is always going to place margin on the outside of elements, as you can see, and it's going to place padding on the inside of elements, as you can see here, which causes this content to be pushed inwards. And then now what I want to do is I want to access the body, and I want the body to have a default color on all the text that is going to appear inside the body, and this color is going to be hashtag this one, so hashtag 3F3D56, which is like a navy blue moving towards like the gray side. So when I save this, then you'll notice that these colors, the color of the text changes just a bit. And then now I want to go inside the container and inside the form and access this H1 so that I push it to the center. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say container form H1, and I'm just going to say text align center, which is going to align the text to the center. And then I want to add a margin on the bottom so that it pushes away from this input. So I'm going to say margin bottom of 2 rem. And then now what I want to do is I want to style this label and I want to style this input. And for this, I want to explain a new concept. So in HTML, we have two types of elements. We have inline elements and we have block elements. So example of inline elements are labels, the small tag which we have used before. We have buttons. We have a span, which is also an inline element. We have anchor tags, which link to other pages. And then examples of block elements. So these are called inline elements. And then examples of block elements that we have are probably everything else. So everything else is a block element. So for example, a div here, a div is a block element, a section is a block element, and H1, or rather all headings are block elements. So all headings are block elements. We can have articles are block elements, aside is a block element, figure is a block element, header is a block element, nav is a block element, and we can also have paragraphs as block elements. Now, the main difference between these two types of elements is that block elements always start on a new line, and inline elements always start within the same line that they are defined in. And I'm going to save this and I'm going to give you an example. And you can see right here that if I come into my form and I add an H2 that says this is a second heading, if I save this, then the H2 starts on a new line. If I go ahead and add an H that says something here, then the H3 is going to start on a new line. However, if I go inside the H3 and I place in a span element, and then I say this is something else, then you notice that the span continues inside the line where the H3 is defined. So that is really how inline and block elements work. Now, using CSS, it is possible to change whether an element is inline or block. Okay, and I'm going to demonstrate this. I'm going to save this here, and then inside my style.css, I'm going to access this particular H3, and then I want to change this span into a block element. So inside my styles.css, I'm going to say for the container form H3, and then I want to target the span, okay, which is an inline element by default. Then I'm going to say display as a block element. And when I save this, notice that now the span inside here starts on a new line, which is meaning it is now a block element. And if you want to change an element into an inline element, for example, I can go inside this H1 and I can say display inline. So it's going to now display as an inline block. And you can see that now the H2 moves upwards. And then now you see another difference of inline elements and block elements, because as you can see, the margin does not work on inline elements. Now, if I disable this, you'll notice that this is pushed downwards because there's a margin here, and then the H1 is also aligned to the center because it is a block element. But for inline element, if I re-enable this, which is going to change this H1 into an inline element, and I save this, notice that the margin no longer applies and the text align center no longer applies. And the reason why it no longer applies is because now the H1 is no longer a block element, but it is now an inline element. And then something else, if I go inside this span and say text align center, you'll notice that the span now responds to such properties. And if I want to say add a margin of 3 rem on the top and bottom and 0 on the left and right, then you notice that now the span has a margin applied to it. But if I come and disable this, which means it's going to go back to being an inline element, and I save it, then notice that these two properties do not work. So that is the main difference between block and inline elements, and we are going to encounter other examples where I'm going to be demonstrating this when we build out our other projects. So I'm going to enable this, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to disable this, comment this out, okay, and then I'm going to comment this out as well, and I'm just going to place some text here on top that says block and inline elements. And you know what, let me just do this. Let me comment this out, and then let me cut this out and push it inside here. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to also copy this on top, and then I'm going to remove this, such that now you're always going to have access to this block of code which I was explaining. Okay, And then now I can go back into my index.html and then I can comment this out. Okay, and then we're going to save this, and then now this is going to be our sign up form. And then now the reason why I was explaining inline and block elements is because the label is also an inline element. That's why you can see that the label is an inline element, and then the input is also an inline element, so they are on the same line. But if you check in our design, we want the label to be on top and then the input on the bottom. So we can do that easily by just going, let me go below this and saying I want to access the container form and all the labels inside. So all the labels inside. So this is going to access all the labels inside, and then I'm just going to say display all the labels as block elements. And then when I do that, you'll notice that now the label is now on top and the input is now on the bottom. And then we want to style the label a bit, so I'm going to say font weight, make this bold, which is going to bolden it. And then I want to make the text uppercase, so I'm going to say text transform uppercase. And then I want to increase the letter spacing just a bit. As you can see that these letters are separated just a bit more than normal. So what I can do that by just saying, letter spacing, set this to about 0.2 rem. Let me see how this looks. Okay, that looks fine. And then I just want to make it a bit smaller because that text is a bit too big. So I'm going to reduce the font size. So I'm going to say font size. By default, it's 16 pixels. So I'm going to say 0.8 rem, which I think is about 14 pixels. And that's looking much, much better. And then now, because it's a block element, then I can apply a margin on it. So I can say margin bottom, because I want it to push away from this input just a bit. So I'm going to say margin bottom of 0.2 rem. Just push it away just a bit. And then now I want to access the input and style the input as well. So I'm going to say that for the container form and for the input, then I want to say remove the border, so border none. And then I also want to say remove the outline when I hover over it, so outline none. And when I save this, that you can see that now the input is just basically white with nothing, even when I click on it, right? And then I also want to increase the padding on the input, and you know what, the padding is going to be a padding of 0.625 rem on the top and bottom, so 10 pixels on the top and bottom, and 1.25 rem on the left and right, which is 20 pixels. And the reason why I know it's 20 pixels is because by default the root em value is 16. So I'm going to save that. And then you know what, actually the border is not going to be none because I want the border to have a line, this line, right? So the border is going to be 2 pixels. So let me say border width is going to be 2 pixels, and then border style is going to be solid, meaning I don't want any dotted lines, I want it to be fully connected. And then border color is going to be our very same color that we had on the body, which is this one right here. So I'm going to save this, and then we should see this on the screen. Okay, would you look at that? But then you'll notice that this is just a bit darker, right? I don't want it to be so dark. So what I'm going to do is I want to add an opacity to this so that it's just a bit lighter. And I can do that in VS Code by just hovering over this color and then dragging this selector downwards, which reduces the opacity. So right around there, I'm going to save this, and we're going to have that. Okay, so once I have the border as that, then I want to add a border radius so that this is just a bit rounded on the edges, as you can see even in the design as well. So I can do that by just going below this and saying border radius and setting this to about 1.25 rem. Let me see how that looks. That's too much. Okay, so I'm going to say 1 rem. That's still too much. Let me say 0.6 rem. And that is much better. Okay, and then now I want that when I focus on the input, then this opacity is removed from the border color, and then it is now set to the full color without any opacity. So I can do that by targeting the focus state. So I can do that by targeting the focus state on the input. So I can say for the dot container, for the form, and for the input, then I'm going to place my full colon, and then I'm going to say that when it has a state of focus, so when we focus on it, then I want the border color to go back to my original color, which is this, so that when I save this, And now look, if I focus on it, then the border is going to change color into the darker version. And then when I remove focus, and then when I remove focus from it by clicking anywhere outside here, then it loses focus. So that is just some bit of like showing your users that they are focused on this element or not. Now there's something that I did here which I did on purpose because I also wanted to explain that you can turn these three lines into one line. So just like we did with the margin and the padding, you can also do the same thing to the border. So I'm going to comment this out, and then I'm going to add this very same styles, but I'm going to do it in one line. So I'm going to say that for the border, I want the border to have a width of 2 pixels, and then I want the border style to be solid, and then I want the border color to be this. So I'm just going to copy this and paste it inside here. And when I save this, you'll notice that nothing changes. So nothing changes because this one line does the very same thing as these 3 lines. And then now when I click on it, you can see that this still works as well. And then when I lose focus on it, then it still works as well. So these are some of the things that you can know, which are just going to optimize your programming. Okay, and then the next thing that I want to do is I want this input to always go till the end for mobile screens, that is. So what I'm going to do is on the input, I'm going to set the width here to 100%. Okay, and then when I set the width to 100%, you can see that now it goes all the way to the end. Even if I were to increase it, then it would always go all the way to the end. Now, the next thing that I want to do is I want to move this container to the center. And then I want to limit it so that it doesn't go all the way to the end on large screens. So how I'm going to do that is that I'm going to go inside my container class, which is this one right here. And I'm going to say set a max width on this of, let's say, 700 pixels. So that now when we exceed 700 pixels, then the container is going to have a max width applied on it, as you can see right here, of 700 pixels. And then I want that when this width of 700 pixels is applied, then I want the container to automatically move to the center. So I can do that by setting a margin of auto on the left and right. And what that will do is that it's going to check the margin on the left and right, and it's going to set an equal margin on both sides. So right inside here where I have defined the margin on the top, or rather margin all round, then I want to add another definition here and say auto. And so what this means is that it's going to apply a margin of 1.25 rem on the top and bottom, and then a margin of auto on the left and right. So I'm going to save this and look at this now. It's now pushed to the center. And then when I reduce it, you're going to notice something, that this container is now pushed all the way to the edges. And that is because of the margin of auto, because we have removed the margin of 1.25 rem all round. Okay, so that is one way that you can do that. And if you want to fix this, then you can do that using what is called media queries, which we have looked at before. So I'm going to remove this from here because I want this margin to be added on the left and right, even on mobile screens. And then I'm going to go to the bottom of my CSS file, and then I'm going to add a media query. So I'm going to say @media, and I'm going to say that when the container is greater than 500 pixels, then I want to access the .container class. And for the .container class, I want to have a margin of 1.25 rem on the top and bottom, and auto on the left and right. And you know what? Because we have set the container max to 700 pixels, then I'm also going to change this to 700 pixels. So I'm going to save this, and now look at this. When we increase it, then it's always going to be centered, as you can see. Very, very nice. Okay, so next let's push this container downwards, and I'm going to use CSS Flexbox to do that. So on the body, I'm going to say display flex. Okay, and by default, remember, Flexbox always aligns items in raw form. As you can see, if I added a second item inside here below the container, so if I add an H2 that says heading 2, so you'll notice that the H2 is going to come here because of Flexbox. Okay, so by default, always it is in raw form. And then below the display flex, I'm going to say align items to the center. And then I'm going to say justify content to the center as well, which is going to push this to the center. And then now I want to push it to the middle. And remember, we do that by adding a fixed height on it. So I'm going to say add a min height of 100 viewport heights. And inside here, I'm just adding 100 viewport heights because the form is never going to overflow outside of the viewport of the user. And then now you'll notice something. The container has shrunk down. And now even if I increase it, you'll notice that even though I added a max width of 700 pixels here, it never increases. So we can fix that by adding a width here on the container. So now we add a width, and I'm going to set this width to 90%, which means that the container is always going to take up 90% of the visible viewport. So I'm going to save this. And then now when I increase it, you can notice first of all that it now already takes up 90% of the container. And then now when I increase it past 700 pixels, then you'll notice that now it gets stuck to 700 pixels, which is what we want. And then now let me add a border radius on the container and a box shadow as well, so that it's just a bit more visible. So on the container, I'm going to say add a border radius of 1 rem. And then I want to add a box shadow here. And the box shadow, the way I explained it in the previous video, but the way I have mastered it is by HOV, VOV, BOV, and then the color. So HOV means horizontal, VOV means vertical, and BOV means the blur. And then obviously the color is going to come to the end. So I'm going to say that I want this to go 0.1 rem on the horizontal, 0.1 rem on the vertical, and 0.1 rem on the blur radius. And then I'm going to say RGBA. So for the color, I want 0.5. So a color of black with an opacity of 0.5. So I'm going to save this, and you can see this is what we have on the container. So I want to reduce this alpha value to about 0.2. Okay, and then probably increase all this 0.1 to 0.2. So 0.2 rem and then 0.2 rem. Okay, that is much better. You can see that now the container is just a bit more visible. And by the way, I should mention that box shadows are detrimental to your performance. So always choose where to add them and where not to add them. Okay, for this case, it's only one box shadow, so the difference in performance is going to be negligible. Okay, so now the next that I'm going to do is I want to add another label and another input, and I'm going to do that by just copying this, so these two, and copying them downwards. And I'm doing this on purpose because I want to explain something. So this is going to change from first name to last name, and once again I'm selecting multiple text by just saying Control and D on VS Code, and then this is going to be last name, and then the type here is going to be text because it's still a type of because the last name is still a type of text. And then it's going to be set to required so that you can't submit the form without filling in this input. So I'm going to save this, and this is what we're going to have on the screen. Now look at the design. So in the design we have the first name on the left and then the last name on the right. So the obvious way that you would think to do this is by going inside the form inner and then displaying this as a grid. But technically, look at what will happen. So I'm going to go right inside, right above this actually. And then I'm going to say that for the container, for the form, and then for the dot form inner class, right? If I say display flex, look at what is going to happen. Now this is going to happen, which is not what we want to happen. And the reason why it happens is because remember that Flexbox, first of all, always places items in raw form by default. So the reason why this happens is because Flexbox is going to take this one as the first item, and then this input as the second item, and then this label as the third item, and then this input as the fourth item. So we want these, the label and the input, to be inside one item. So I'm going to cut them out and place them inside an article, and then just like that. And then for the second label and the input, I'm going to cut it out and place it inside another article. And remember, the articles just act the same way as the div. You can have the article to be the child of the div, or you can have the div to be the child of the article, and it's not really going to make much difference. So that when I save this, now we are going to have this. Look at this. Okay, so now already you can see that the HTML has corrected itself. And by the way, if you didn't know about labels, if I try to click on the label here, you can see that focus is automatically placed on this. And if I try to click on this, then focus is automatically placed on this, because we are referencing the last name here, which is the name of the input, and we're referencing the first name here, which is the name of the input, and we are saying label for first name, and so on and so forth. Now what I want to do is, instead of using flexbox here, I want to introduce CSS grid. So I'm just going to say display grid, and then I'm going to save this, and you'll notice that they're aligned one on top of the other. Now by default, display grid doesn't really work on its own. So you would need to add another property here called grid dash template dash columns, like so, in order for display grid to work. And what grid template columns does is it asks you how many columns do you want your grid to be. So if I want my grid to be 2 columns, for example, then I would say 1 fractional column for the first grid, and then 1 fractional column for the second grid. So this is going to count as 1 grid, and then this is going to count as the second grid. Okay, so when I save this, then what should happen is this, the first name and this input should display on the left, and then this should display on the right. So I'm going to save this, and you can see that is what happens. Okay, but because we are on mobile screens, what I want to do is I want them to go one on top of the other. So I'm going to remove this. Okay, and then they are going to go one on top of the other. And then now what I want to do is I want to add a space between this first input and this second input, and I can do that in CSS grid by adding a property called gap, and I'm going to add a gap of 1.25 rem, which is 20 pixels. And when I save this, you can see that now they separate out. And just the way CSS Flexbox works, grid is also going to check that we are inside the form inner class. Okay, so the article inside here is going to be the first grid item, and then this article is going to be the second grid item. Okay, so that's the very same way that CSS grid works. And then what I want to do is I want to add a media query, so that when we are past 700 pixels right around here, then this is going to display on the left and then the last name on the right. So I can do that, and you have already seen how we have done that by just changing the grid template columns, right? So inside our media query, inside here, I'm going to go inside the dot container class, and inside the form and inside the dot form inner, like so. And then I'm going to say grid template columns, because that is the property that we want to change. So grid template columns, and change this into 1fr 1fr, so 1 fractional column each, and you'll see that now they take up 1 fractional column for each one of them right there. Now if you don't want to keep on repeating 1fr for like 12 grids, for example, so if I keep on adding, let me just copy this. So if I keep on adding this, right, then what is going to happen is that you'll notice the grids are still being added even though there are no elements. And let's imagine that you wanted to have multiple elements. Okay, then repeating 1fr for each one of those elements becomes a bit hectic. So what you can do is you can just cut this out, and we can use a function called repeat, and we can repeat how many times do you want it to repeat. You want it to repeat like 12 times, and each grid is going to have 1 fractional column each. So when I save this, then you'll notice that now we're going to have 12 grids. And you know what, I can even showcase that for you by going into my developer tools, and notice how grid is displayed. So grid is displayed in terms of these kind of columns, as you can see. So you can see that this is the first grid is here, which is the first name, then the second, then the third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth, ninth, 10th, 11th, and finally the 12th one at the end. But now I don't want them to display as 12 grids. I want them to display as 2 grids. So I'm just going to change this into 2 grids and save this, and we should have this on the screen. So now we only have 2 grid items. As you can see, they're just separated by this gap, which is a gap of 20 pixels because we set the grid gap right here. So the gap is going to be 1.25 rem, which is 20 pixels, because once again our root em value is 16 pixels. So 16 by 1.25 equals 20. Okay, so you can see that our design is coming in slowly by slowly, and then now when I put focus on this one, then this one loses focus and it turns into this slightly less opaque color. And then now what I want to do is I want to do the very same thing right inside here. I just want to go and copy this div with a class of form inner. So just copy this div, paste it downwards, and then now for the label for this, we're going to be changing this up a bit. So this one is going to be email, and then the label for this is going to be going to the email. And then the input, we're going to change this input, and I'm going to say input type is going to be a type of email. And the reason why we do that is because for HTML validation, if you don't set a type of email here, then it's not going to give you the proper validation. Okay, and then the name for this is going to be email, so that it can link to this label, so that when you click on this label, then this is the input that is going to be highlighted. And then I'm going to give this an ID of email as well, and then I'm going to set it to required, so that you cannot submit the form without filling in this input. And then once we have this, then we're going to have an input. We're going to change this into date of birth, and then the label for this is going to be DOB, and then the input type for this is now going to be date, and then the name is going to be DOB because that's what we have inside here, and then the ID is also going to be DOB. And I've just remembered something. You cannot have multiple elements having the same ID, but you can have multiple elements having the same class name. As you can see, we have form inner here and form inner on top here. So that is also another rule of HTML, that if you want to add an ID to an element, then it has to be unique, because two elements cannot share the same ID. So we're going to save this, and we should see this on the screen. So we have email here, and then we have date of birth. And then you'll notice something, that there's a grid gap here, but there's no grid gap here, and then there's a grid gap here. But if I add another fourth one here, which we're actually going to do, then it's not going to have a grid gap. Okay, so what I'm going to do is inside this .form inner class, I'm going to copy this once again, copy it down here, and then I should check that we need our password and confirm password. So the label for this is going to go into password, and then this text is going to say password, and then the input type for this is going to be password, and then the name is going to be password, so that it links to the label, and then the email is going to be, the ID, sorry, is going to be password-1 and password1, because this one is going to be password2, because remember, once again, you cannot have the same ID on multiple elements. And then, you know what, I'm just going to copy this and paste it inside here, and then this is going to be the label for password. You know, let me call this password2, and the name for this is going to be password-2, so that now I can change this into password-1, and then change the name for this into password-1. Okay, and then change this ID into password-2, oops, like so. Set it to required, and then the input type is still going to be password, and then this is going to be confirm password, so confirm password. So that should be correct. So input type password. Okay, so I'm going to save this, and then we're going to have this on the screen. Look at that, fantastic. And then now the interesting thing is that for the password field, if I try to type in, then you can see that it is automatically hidden. So that's why these input types are very, very important for you to know, because you always want that the passwords should be hidden. And then if you want to select a date, you can see that it creates a month, day, year for you, and then it also gives you a date picker. Now, I know you're probably wondering why I decided to change the label here to password2, and then the name to password2, and I did password2 and did the same on top here to password1. So let me show you what is going to happen if you have the label here and the label here, as well as the names into the same thing. So I'm going to change this into password1, and I'm going to save this. And then now look at this. If I try to click on the label here, it highlights password1 correctly. But if I try to click on confirm password, which we expect to be password2, then look at this, password1 is still the one being applied. And the reason why it's being applied is because password1 is referencing this input, and it is not referencing this one. So that's why I changed this one into password2. Okay, so once we have that, then I'm going to go into our CSS, and I want to add margin on top of each one of this, and on top of this one as well. So what I'm going to do is inside the form inner class, which we have somewhere, and the form inner class is the div that holds every pair of inputs. So inside here, I'm going to say that set a margin on top of 1.25 rem, and it's going to be the same margin as the gap, so that the spacing is going to be maintained. You can see that. And then now look at this very, very interesting thing. If I try to scale this up, then right around here, because we already added a media query, remember, we added a media query here of grid template columns to repeat twice for the form inner class. then you'll notice that now right here we're going to be repeating this item twice because we already added the media query. So now the next thing that I want to do is I want to increase the padding all around on this container on large screen. So right around here, then I want to set the margin, the padding to 2 rem, not 22 rem, just to push this inwards just a bit. And then now I want to create our submit button. Okay, so every form has to have a submit button. So right below, right here, below this div and below the closing tag of the form, I want to create a button here with a class of btn, and I'm going to call this submit. And then this button is going to have a type of submit, and the type of submit is important because I want that when I click this button, it triggers the event called submit on the form. So I'm going to save this, and you'll notice that if I try to click this button, then it's going to highlight this input and it's going to tell me please fill in this field. And the reason for that is because of the required validation from HTML5 that we have added to each of the inputs. So I'm going to save this, and then now I want to style our submit form, our submit button, sorry. So inside our style.css, I'm just going to go right here. So for the container, I want to access the form and I want to access the class of btn on the button. And then I'm going to say, first of all, give this a text color of white, so hashtag FFF, and then give it a padding of 0.625 rem on the top and bottom and 1.25 rem on the left and right, which is the same as the inputs. And then I want this to have a font size of 1 rem, which is 16 pixels. Okay, and then I want this to have a background color of our hashtag 3, this one. So this color is going to be our primary color, so save this, and we're going to have that. Okay, and then something that I didn't mention is that buttons and inputs do not take up the default font family on the body. So even if we are to set this font family of Inter here on the body, then you'll notice that buttons and inputs are not going to take up that default font family. So I want to change that by just going below this body inside now our index.css, so inside our global style sheet, and I'm going to say that for the inputs and for the buttons, then I want this to have a font family of inherit. And what this means is it's going to inherit the font family of the body. So when I save this, you can see that now the font family on the button changes as well. And then back inside our styles.css, inside our button, I'm going to set a margin on the top of 1.25 rem, which is going to push away from this input. And then I want to remove this black border that you're seeing. So I'm going to say border, set this to none. And then I want that when I focus on it, it also shouldn't have a border. So I'm going to say outline none, which is going to remove that. And then let's add a border radius. So border dash radius of 0.625 rem all around. And then let's increase the padding. So I'm going to right here, let's increase this padding to about 3 rem on the left and right. So we're going to have this. Okay, now let's target the hover state for the button. So I'm going to copy this and I'm going to place my colon and say that when the button has a state of hover, so when I hover over it, then the first thing that I want to do is change this cursor into a pointer. So I'm going to say cursor pointer, and then I want to reduce the opacity to about 0.75. So I'm going to save this and notice how this button now works. Look at this. Now that is the hover state of the button. So when I hover over it, then this happens. And if you want, you can add a transition here. So I'm going to say transition all the elements, or you know what, I can just say transition the opacity by 0.2 seconds, and I'm going to say is in out, so that now the opacity is going to transition instead of just popping in. Now the next thing that we're going to do in this form is we're going to create these 2 toggle buttons, which is going to be very interesting because we're going to be using what are called CSS hacks, because there is no type of toggle in CSS, but there is a type of checkbox. So let's do that next. And you know what, I've just realized this button says create account, not submit. So let's change it. Inside our index.html, let's change this into create account. There we go. So below this div and above this button, I'm going to create another div, and I want this div to have a class of checkboxes, like so. And then inside here, I'm going to have an input with a type of checkbox. Okay, so this is the shorthand property that you can use if you're using Emmet. So input colon checkbox if you want to create an input of type checkbox, or you can say input type text if you want to create an input of type text, or you can say input type email if you want to create an input of type email, and you can say input type URL if you want to create an input with a type of URL that accepts a URL to a website, for example. So input type checkbox, and then the name for this is going to be checkbox with an ID of checkbox. And then I'm also going to set this to required so that you always have to check the checkbox before you submit the form. And then because I want to style this differently, then I'm going to give this a class of checkbox. So checkbox. And then below this input, I'm going to have a label, and this label is going to be for the checkbox, like so. And then inside here, we're going to be styling our this ball in the middle. Okay, so inside here, I'm going to create a div with a class of ball, and then that is going to be our label. So I'm going to open this up, and you can see that now we have our checkbox right inside here. So let's begin styling this out. And this is probably going to backfire on me because it's been a while since I created such a checkbox. So what I'm going to do is right below this container, I want to target the class of checkbox. And I'm going to begin by saying display none, which is going to hide it. So display none hides it and removes it from the content of the website. You can do this equally by just setting the opacity to 0, but remember that opacity is still going to place it on the website, meaning it's still going to take up the same content that it used to take up. And if you want to remove it from taking up the space on the web page, then you can set this to position absolute, which is going to remove it. However, I do not recommend doing that, so I'm just going to disable these two, and then I'm going to enable this. And then now what I want to do is I want to target this label, right? So I'm going to give this label a class name. Oh, sorry, not class name. I'm not in React. So I'm going to give this a class of label, like so. Save this, and then right below this, I'm going to target the class of label that I have. The class of label, remember, this is no longer the label element. This is the label that has a class of label. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to say position this as relative. And then I'm going to say background color. Background color, I'm going to set this to transparent. And I'm going to explain why we have this line in a few moments, but just have it in for now. And then I'm going to say, let's say display flex. Okay, and then align item center. And then I'm just going to say justify content to space between. And then I'm going to be explaining these lines in a few moments. I just want to write them out. And then I'm going to say border radius of 50 pixels. And then I'm going to have a padding of 1.25 rem all round, so 20 pixels all round. And then I'm going to say margin of 0 on the top and bottom and 1.25 rem on the left and right. And then I'm going to set this width to 50 pixels. And then I'm going to set the height to 26 pixels. And then I'm going to have a cursor of pointer. Okay, so save this. And we don't have anything yet on the screen, but notice that because I have a cursor pointer here, then I can hover over it here, and you see that our checkbox runs right here. So the next that I'm going to do is I'm going to now target this div inside here with the class of ball. So I'm going to go below this, and I'm going to say that for the dot ball class, then I want the background color. So background color, I'm going to change it into our primary color. So when I save this, nothing is going to happen because I need to position it absolute. So position absolute, and then I'm going to explain this as well. This is getting exciting. So position absolute, and then I'm going to say position to the top by 2 pixels, and then to the left by 2 pixels, and then I'm going to say border radius of 50%, and then a width of 22 pixels, and a height as well of 22 pixels to make it square and rounded. And then I'm going to say transition, so transition, and I'm going to say transform. So transition transform by 0.15 seconds in a linear fashion, so in a straight line. Okay, so let me save this, and now look at this. Okay, so we have our ball right here, and remember that the label here is going to be our the label is going to be this white background that we're seeing. And you know what, let me do that right here by removing this background color, by changing the background color transparent to white. So you can see our label is this right here. Okay, and then now I want to target another state below this and say that for the dot checkbox. Okay, so for the dot checkbox, which is where is it, this one right here, so for our input, so for the dot checkbox, I want to check for a state of checked, and the state of checked is whether it has the tick or not. Then I want to access the label and the ball by saying plus dot label, dot label, and the dot ball class, and I'm going to say transform, and I'm going to say translate on the x-axis by 24 pixels, and these widths inside here and these heights are chosen on purpose because I'm going to show you in a moment. And then when I save this, now look at this, when it has a state of checked, then what we expect is this ball should move from here to the end. So let's try it. Look at that. Interesting, is it not? Quite interesting. And then notice how this white background is a bit too big and the ball is small. So what I'm going to do is on the label, I'm going to go inside this padding and disable it. Yeah, just disable the padding. And so in fact, let me just remove it from inside here. And then now we can begin talking about all these properties that we've added. So the border radius of 50 pixels is what adds the border. And you know, let me change this to black because it's not really visible. Or let me change it to green. Oops, green. So the border radius of 50 pixels is what gives this background color of green a border radius of 50 pixels, this kind of rounded border. If I disable it, then you see that it's going to be a rectangle, which we do not want, right? So I'm going to enable it, and then the margin, and then the margin of 0 on the top and bottom and 1.25 rem on the left and right is what places this margin on the left here as well as on the right. So if I disable it, then you'll see that it's going to move it back to the left. And you know what I want to do is I want the margin to be 1.25 rem on the top and bottom and 0 on the left and right, so that this moves downwards. Okay, and then the width of 50 pixels is what limits this label to right around here, so that it doesn't go all the way to the end. So if I disable it, you'll notice that it's going to go all the way to the end, yet our input is only going to be within this space. Okay, so I'm going to enable it, and then of course the height of 26 pixels is what gives this label once again this height that you're seeing. So if I disable it, then it's not going to have any height. And then the cursor of pointers, just to make sure that when I hover over it, the cursor changes like so. The ball is what is moving inside here. So when it has a background color of this, which is dark, and then this is positioned absolute, and then our label is positioned relative. So the way positioning works is that when you position an element absolute, by default, it's going to be positioned absolute within the body. However, if you give the parent a position of relative, then it's going to be positioned absolutely relative to the parent of the element. So for example, if I disable this position relative here, you'll notice that now the ball goes all the way to the top, which we don't want because we want to position it within this element, which is the label, which is the parent, because the label inside here, where is it? Because the label is the parent of the ball. So let's enable it once again so that it goes back. And then a top of 2 pixels is just what makes it so that it doesn't go all the way to the top. I don't know whether zooming in helps, but let me try. So notice that it is just 2 pixels. It doesn't go all the way to the top of the label, right? So that's why we have set it 2 pixels from the top, and then left of 2 pixels, just make sure that it doesn't go all the way to the end as well, right inside here. And if you increase this to about, let's say 4 pixels, what you'll notice is that it pushes inwards just a bit. Okay, so I'm going to change this back to 2 pixels. Fantastic. And then the border radius of 50% is what makes this ball rounded, and it makes it rounded because we have set it to a fixed width of 22 pixels and a fixed height of 22 pixels, which means it's going to be a square. And then when I add the border radius of 50%, it's going to turn it into a circle. So if I disable this, let me zoom out. So if I disable this, look at this, now it's a square. Now it still works, but you don't want a square because it's not a good UI. So adding the border radius of 50% is what makes it rounded into this ball. And then transition transform 0.15 seconds in a linear fashion is what moves it from the left to the right and from the right to the left when it is checked, because we are checking for a state of checked inside here. And then we're saying that when it has a state of checked, then we want to translate it on the x-axis by 24 pixels because the transition here is working on the transform property, and the transform property is this one here. And we're saying that for the transform property, then translate it on the x-axis by 24 pixels, which means move it on the x-axis by 24 pixels. So that is what we have inside here, and that is how we create this toggle button. Okay, fantastic. So I'm going to change this back into white, so FFF. And by the way, you should know that display flex and align in depth center, and this is just for fun. So even if you disable it, then nothing is going to change on the screen. And the reason why I added this in is because there is some text that I'm going to add that I want to appear here. So I'm going to, you know what, let me just disable it for now, and then when I add in the text, then you'll see what is going to happen, which I'm going to do next. So right inside here, I want to say that for the label right below this, then I'm going to say add a paragraph that says, what does it say? It says, so the paragraph says, I have read and agreed to the terms of service outlined in the privacy policy. So I have read and agree to the terms of service outlined in the privacy policy. Okay, so when I save that, then we have this displaying on the screen. Okay, and you know what, I've just realized that we don't really even need this to be here because it doesn't do anything. So I have read and agreed to the terms of service. Okay, fantastic. Now what I want to do is, instead of this being a paragraph, I want to change it into a small tag. Okay, so that the text is just going to be a bit smaller. And then now what I'm going to do is, I want this div called checkboxes to be a flex box, so that now I'm going to display this input and the label as one item, and then the small tag as the second item. So what I'm going to do is, I'm going to cut this out and place it inside an article like so. And then, you know what, when I save this, then what is going to happen is that the checkbox now, when I display it as a flex box, then the article is going to be the first item, and this small element is going to be the second item. So inside my styles.css, I can go inside, where is it, this div with a class of checkboxes, which is above this. I'm going to say for the checkboxes, so checkboxes, and I'm going to say display flex like so, and then I'm going to say align dash items to the center. And then you know what, the reason why it is not completely aligned to the center is because we have a margin on the top and bottom on the label. So what I'm going to do is, now I'm going to change this up once again, and I'm going to say I want a margin of 0 on the top and bottom, and 1.25 rem on the right, and then 0 on the bottom and 0 on the left. Okay, so I'm going to save this, and this is what is going to happen. And then now I'm going to go inside this div with a class of checkboxes, and I'm going to say margin top of 2 rem, which is going to push it away from this, so that now we have our checkbox. Okay, and then right below this, I'm just going to say justify content to the start, so that this content is always going to be justified to the left. Okay, so that is our first checkbox. And then now we're going to create our second checkbox by just copying this div with the class of checkboxes. So copy and paste it below this. And then now what I'm going to do is, I'm going to change this ID once again into checkbox 2. So checkbox 2, remember, because we can't have two IDs of the same name. So the name of this is also going to be checkbox 2. The type is still going to be checkbox, and the label for this is going to be checkbox dash 2. Okay, so we're going to have that. And then the text for this second one, it says receive emails about new updates and features. So cut this out and say receive emails about new updates and features, and say no spam included. So save this, and then we should have this on the screen. Would you look at this? Looking amazing. It does. Okay, so this is our form right here, and you know what, this margin is a bit too big. It's a bit too big. So let's go inside here and change this into 1 rem. Let me see how this looks. 1 rem. Let me say 0.5 rem. A bit of trial and error. 0.5 rem. And you know what, let me do this. Let's change this up and say I want a margin of 1 rem on the top, and then I'm going to say 0 on the right, and then I'm going to say 0.5 rem on the bottom and 0 on the left. Okay, so that we're going to have this. So this is looking quite nice. And you remember that because all of these are set to required, if I try to submit the form, then it's not going to work. Now, a bonus thing that I do want to do, remember I said that I want to show you how we can use Flexbox and Grid. So we used Grid to display these items. So now I want to use Flexbox, and it's going to be quite easy. So what I'm going to do is right inside here, I'm going to place this back to the right, where we had our form, inner. Now I'm no longer going to use display grid. Instead, I'm going to say display flex. So display flex, and then by default, remember they go as a raw form. And then now what I want to do is that for mobile screens, I want them to stack one on top of the other. So I'm going to say flex direction, set this to column, which is going to cause them to stack one on top of the other. And then now what I want to do is notice how now the spacing is a bit messed up because we are no longer having a grid gap, right? So I'm going to access all the articles within this class. So I'm going to just paste this downwards and say that for all the articles, then I want a margin dash top of 1.25 rem, and then I'm going to disable this, otherwise it's going to increase the margin a bit more. And you can see that now all the articles have a margin on top of 1.25 rem. If I did not disable this, then the margins are going to be increased for each one of these, because each of these divs, remember, is a pair. So I'm going to comment this out. Okay, and then now on larger screens, what we want to do is we want to change the flex direction into row, so that now they're going to be aligned on the left and the right. So right inside here, now notice that this no longer applies because we don't have a display grid. So I'm going to say change the flex, and you know, let me just disable it, and then I'm going to say flex direction, set this into row, which is going to do this. Now of course Flexbox requires a bit more styling to be applied. So what I'm going to do is, once again, I'm just going to copy this downwards, and then I'm going to say on these large screens, then I want the margin, so margin dash right to be 1.25 rem, and then of course I want this to be applied on the articles. So the articles like so it adds this margin of 1.25 rem, and you know what, the margin of 1.25 rem is applied even on these articles. So because we don't want it to apply on these articles, on these second ones really, and we only want it to apply on this first one so that they can be separated out like this, then we can use another pseudo selector in CSS called not. So you can say full colon not, and then I want to say that I don't want to select this last child, so I can place another full colon and say last dash child. And then when I save this, then the margin is only going to be applied on this first article and not on the second article. So that's what this does. And then now what I want to do is I want these articles to take up the entire space that they're in, right? So I can do that by just copying this once again. So copying it and pasting it above this, and then I can use another property called flex like so, and just set it to 1. And when I save this, then this happens. So what flex of 1 does is that it just tells the article to take up 100% of the width that they are in. And in this case, because we have a flexbox set to row, then it's going to take up 100% of the section. So that's how you can use flexbox to style this out as well if you want to use flexbox. And if you don't want to use flexbox, then you can use grid as I had shown you on top right inside here. Now the question that you're going to ask is, what if you want this form to work? There are a number of ways that you can make this form work. If you want to deploy this to Netlify, for example, then all you have to do is go inside your form, inside your form right here, and add an attribute here called Netlify. And then once you save this and you deploy this to Netlify, every form submission is going to be going into your Netlify account, and you can see the form submissions if you want. Now, another way that you can make this form work is by using what is called form submit. And form submit, as you can see, the description is that it forms easy endpoints for your HTML forms. And all you have to do is add an action attribute and then place in this link inside here and link it to your email. And then you add a method of post. So for example, inside here now, instead of Netlify, you can have an action. So form action equals to, and action, the action attribute is what the form should do or where the form should be submitted when you submit it, when you click the submit button. So the action for this we're setting to https form submit.co, and then you can place in your email. So place in your email inside here. And then what it's going to do is also add a method of post. So method equals to post. And the method of post is to ensure that when you submit the form, then it's not going to appear in the address bar. Because for example, let me try and submit this form. So if I try and submit this form, look at the address bar. Okay, so create account, and it's going to pop this up, of course, but look at this. It shows you that the first name that you entered is this, the last name you entered is this, your email is this, and then it's going to show you that your date of birth is, let me just show you. So it's going to show that the date of birth is 2006, which is today, and then your password that you entered here is this, and the password 2 is this. And you know, you don't really want that to happen when you're submitting forms, otherwise anyone can get access to your client information, for example. So that's why you have a method of post, because post encrypts it. So once you place in your email inside here, then you have to go in and submit the form at least once, so that it gives you a validation to your email, which is going to activate the form. So that is how you can use form submit to create a backend for your form service in your website, for example. And I've just realized that I don't want this second input to be required, because I don't want to force people into receiving emails, but I do want to force them to agree to the privacy policy before they create their account. So I can go into this second input here and remove this required, and we can now submit the form without setting it into required. So that is going to be our sign up form. And then now what I want to do is I want to commit this into GitHub. So once again, I'm going to show you how to commit this into GitHub. So I'm going to say cd into project 2 really sign up form, like so. And then I'm going to say git add design.jpg, and I'm going to say git commit design file, like so. And then I'm going to say git add index.html and git commit index.html, and say git add styles.css, and I'm going to say git commit, I'm going to say style sheet. Okay, and then I also want to commit this index.css because we made a change here for the inputs and the buttons. So I'm going to cd back out of this, and I'm going to say git add index.css, and I'm going to say git commit, and I'm going to say have inputs and buttons take the font family of the body. And then I'm going to say git push, which is going to push these changes into GitHub. And then when I check this GitHub repository, then you're going to see that 23 seconds ago, this is the last commit that we made. Okay, fantastic. So in the next project, we're going to be building our model.